Thank you, Karen. So this next panel is focused on labor market statistics. I'm Katharine Abraham. Look, this next panel is focused on labor market statistics. Understanding what's going on in the labor market is obviously pretty central to understanding what's going on in the economy. Perhaps the single most watched labor market statistic is the payroll employment numbers. We care a lot about what's happening to employment. We've been hearing a lot about that in recent months. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a survey that's well designed to capture what's happening to payroll employment. It's competently executed. The BLS produces objective statistics on what's happening to job growth. But I think it's fair to say that both the BLS and the users of the payroll employment data are concerned about the extent of revisions in those data, both at a month-to-month frequency and then at an annual frequency. So one of the things that people who care about labor market statistics are asking is there a better way to, are there ways to improve the payroll job survey numbers, or even are there other ways to generate information on what's happening to payroll employment? Payroll employment's obviously not the only thing that people care about with respect to what's going on in the labor market. Policymakers, business decision makers care about what's happening to wages and salaries. They care about what's happening to labor turnover, what's happening with job openings. They're interested in the characteristics of current employment. They're interested in the characteristics of the jobs that employers are trying to fill. They're interested in how the nature of the employment relationship is changing. Are people working as employees? What's going on with the gig economy? So there's lots of things about the labor market that we'd like to do, in many cases, a better job of measuring, and that's part of what we're here to talk about on this panel. I know that the several panel members will have insightful things to say about several of these topics, but I think this is also the beginning of a conversation. As Jim already mentioned, Matthew and I are planning a conference to be held in September to pursue some of these issues, but let's see how far we can get today. I'd like to introduce our panel members. The first speaker will be Ryan Decker, who is the chief of the Industrial Output Branch section at the Federal Reserve Board. Ryan's done a lot of important work on entrepreneurship, on labor market dynamics, but he's also given a lot of thought to ways to improve the measurement of payroll employment. Ezra Karger is a senior economist at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, and he'll be talking about the Chicago Fed's labor market indicators. Karen Kimbrough, the chief economist at LinkedIn, is here with us today. I'm imagining you'll be talking, among other things, about LinkedIn's measures of in-demand jobs. And then online, Nela Richardson, who's the chief economist at ADP, will be joining us to talk about some of the products that ADP produces, and in particular, the new weekly employment series that ADP is producing. So let me stop and turn it over to Ryan.
Wow, there's a lot of pop-ups here. Okay. There are a lot of questions. Now I need to do something to share on Zoom, right? I'm all set. Okay. Okay, I'm Ryan Decker. And as Katharine said, I'm at the Federal Reserve Board. I want to emphasize the disclaimer there at the bottom that my comments today do not represent the views of the Federal Reserve staff or Board of Governors. I'm the chief of the Industrial Output section. I'm involved with both the board's expanded measurement agenda, which is a program that was instigated by David Wilcox when he was there. And I'm also involved with publishing Industrial Production, which, since David brought it up, is a blended product to this day, always has been a blended product. We combine official government data with private sector data. Today, I'm going to focus, though. Yep, thank you. Today, I'm going to focus on the payroll survey, or the CES, which the BLS publishes every month to tell us how many jobs were created on net during the month. To get us all on the same page, the CES consists of two parts. The first is a sample coming from a survey of establishments, and they focus on matched continuer establishments. Those are establishments that had employment, reported employment, both last month and this month, and they'll calculate the growth rate of those matched continuers and then aggregate up as needed. But of course, this ignores newly created establishments, births, as well as establishments that are shutting down, deaths. And, these births and deaths are basically impossible to reliably survey, okay, from a business side. So the BLS does a couple of things to address that. And the one that I'll mention is the net establishment birth death model, which is an ARIMA forecast model that forecasts monthly contributions to job growth from net birth and death of establishments. And that model jumps off of hard data from 9 to 12 months prior. Now, you might be tempted, and I think most people think of the CES as it's a survey, and there's this little bit of birth-death machinery going on the side. But in fact, in recent years, the birth-death model has accounted for more than 2/3 of total private payroll gains, as you can see from this chart. And even before the pandemic, it was something like half. So in some senses, the model is the data. This is really important. Now, finally, the CES has a 2-month revision window. And so that means that each month's report comes with revised data for the prior 2 months based on late arriving survey responses, as well as updated seasonal adjustment factors. The monthly revision window then closes until the annual revision, which involves benchmarking to the QCW, among other things, which covers nearly all employer businesses. The first point that I want to make, this is kind of annoying. There we go. The first point that I want to make, I think CES takes a bit more heat than it deserves. It's a very nice product for several reasons. One is that it has nearly full census benchmark information with a lag of just 3 quarters. This is very remarkable. Most of our other business surveys are benchmarked to other surveys, larger surveys, and with a lag of a couple of years. So CES actually is quite remarkable. The CES does revise. It's been in the news, but data revisions mean you're getting better data. I'm always a little puzzled when I hear people say, trust the unemployment rate more because it doesn't revise. Well, the unemployment rate can't revise. That's why it doesn't revise. Okay, we don't get full truth benchmarks for all surveys, but we do for CES, which is great. The net birth death model takes a lot of heat, and I'll push on it a little bit today, but you can see in this figure that the predictions of that model, these are annual predictions in the dashed line, and the blue solid is the actual birth death contributions that come in the benchmark article. These predictions are remarkably good. I don't know how many of you have forecast models that do this well 9 to 12 months into the future. And finally, CES has clear and thorough technical documentation. I think compared to many surveys, it's very, very good. But there are certainly areas of concern, including the falling initiation rates David was showing, response rates, and the recent revision patterns. So I'm going to base my suggestions today on what are the actual sources of the important revisions, and can we do anything about it? So as I mentioned, one way that the data revise is in the monthly release cadence. And I don't want to understate the importance of these revisions, but I'm less concerned than I think some folks might be. First, the top chart there is showing the portion, well, it's showing the monthly revisions in the black line. That's the revision from the first to third print. Okay, I'm abstracting from annual revisions in this. First to third print, monthly revisions, that's the black line as a percent of employment. The shaded blue area shows the portion of those revisions that is coming from re-estimated seasonal factors. BLS re-estimates these every month, concurrent seasonal adjustment, and those can swing around and they're supposed to clear out the typical seasonal fluctuations. Now, anyone who's worked on seasonal adjustment over the last 5 years knows that this has been tremendously difficult in the wake of the pandemic. These seasonal factors have been a moving target. I think that this is a problem that'll become less acute with time, and in any case, I think it'd be very hard to have done anything about it. The other reason to worry less about monthly revisions is that we never actually benchmark to a monthly truth. We'll never know them, or at least never benchmark to the monthly truth. Whether we'll know it is a little bit debatable. But we'll never benchmark to monthly truth. That third print still features sampling error. It still features birth-death model contributions, and those monthly wiggles are going to live on in the data forever, even after annual benchmarks. So, we'll never know anyways. So I worry more about annual benchmark revisions. And as I wrote at the bottom here, in my view, the performance of CES and any private sector alternative to CES should be judged not by first to third revisions that get a lot of news in real time, but rather by annual benchmark revisions. And you can see the annual benchmark revisions there in the black line on the bottom chart. Those are again in percent of employment. And I've put the preliminary benchmark revision for 2025 at the end there, which would be the largest since 2009. And the BLS has said that these benchmark revisions come from a few sources. First, we have response error. That is, the survey respondent tells you a different number than what they're reporting to the UI system. We also have non-response error, which is establishments not returning the survey. And I put the contribution from those sources under other errors in red. And then we have the birth-death model forecast errors in green. And what you see in green is that years with large benchmark revisions tend to have large birth-death model errors. So those are the key sources of revision, and I'll provide some thoughts on each. On the issue of response and non-response error, I don't see a solution other than more data. Now, I wonder, first of all, what other public sector data sources could help us here. I suspect there may be some. For example, the IRS gets tax withholding information from every firm on a regular basis. Australia is already using this kind of information in a payroll measurement product they have. It's currently under redesign. Of course, this would likely require policy changes, and I don't have opinions on policy. But there's also private sector data, and I think even just the top handful of private payroll providers and the like could easily get us past a third of employment in the US, probably much higher than that. In my own work with colleagues, Tomasz Seiner, who's here, and others, starting almost 10 years ago, we constructed an aggregate payroll measure from payroll provider data, and we found that the index we made can help predict benchmark revisions, and in fact, some years even does better than CES in predicting benchmark revisions. So I'm confident that private data can be helpful here. But in my view, we should strongly prefer that these data be provided to the BLS at the establishment level as microdata, and rather than as published aggregate products, as helpful as those might be. That's a key lesson of my experience with various private sector employment data sets over many years. Why? Well, for one thing, private companies, as has been mentioned, have different needs, incentives, and goals with their aggregated products that may not match the statistical system's needs. Moreover, there are choices. Go and try to build your own version of CES. I've done it. There's lots of choices you have to make when doing this. For example, bias adjustment is a term I'll use as a catch-all term to include the birth-death model, but the way in which you make your continuous sample-based estimates mappable to benchmarks to give you a sensible number of jobs. That decision you make, which you have to make in a forward-looking manner, will make or break your benchmark performance, as you can guess from the fact that the birth-death model is 2/3 of published payroll gains, private payroll gains. It's also unclear how private sector samples may overlap or not with each other and with CES surveys. And there are other methodological issues around industry classification, how you filter outliers, what level of business unit do you look at, firms and establishments, and so on. There's lots of choices and there's lots of details here. The BLS folks are the pros, and with the establishment level data, I'm confident they can do a better job than any of us can do on the outside of their firewall. A second way to work on the response and non-response problem may be to improve estimates, even of continual growth rates, by using all the quarters of QCW data, not just the first quarter as the current annual benchmarking process does. Now, BLS staff have studied the possibility of quarterly benchmarking, and in 2021, they said they'd prefer not to do it. Fair enough. But there may be advantages of somehow incorporating the quarterlies. For example, the NBER data already incorporate quarterly QCW in the income data. So if CES were doing that, that would be more consistent with the NBERs. Perhaps more to the point, outside forecasters are already using quarterly QCW data to adjust CES for likely benchmark revisions. We can have everyone outside doing it themselves, or we can have the pros at BLS do it again, and they'd probably do a better job. Now, a full detailed benchmark is an enormous amount of work. We're almost finished with IP. I wouldn't wish it on anyone, but I think it need not be a full detailed benchmark every quarter, as there are other ways to take signal from quarterly data that may improve estimates without a full benchmark, and that's a longer conversation. In my last slide, I'll talk about the other big source of benchmark errors, the net birth death model. And again, I'll think about more data. First, I wonder what other public sector data can be brought to bear. Now I'm going to do some very amateur hour econometrics here. So for example, in the current method, the August jobs report that was published in early September featured birth death model forecasts that were based on QCW data from the third quarter of last year. But by that time, the Q4 QCW data were public, and even the QCW-based business employment dynamics, or BED, for Q4 was public. Now, I don't want to overstate this. I think much more research is needed. But in very, very rough in-sample, basically back of the envelope regressions, I find that BED data in hand can improve forecasts of annual benchmark birth death contributions, as I show in the table here with root mean squared errors RMSE in thousands of jobs, and lots of people are doing this. Even just having BED data through the third quarter, which are available in late April, may improve forecasts of the true birth death contributions 9 months before those true contributions will be published in early February of the following year. So I think it's worth revisiting what, if anything, can be done here to get more timely information into the model estimation, even if we're just throwing some aggregates into a regression after the detailed micro level part is estimated, because I know that's a lot of work. There may also be other resources like business formation statistics. The National Directory of New Hires has been mentioned before, or again, IRS data that might provide some concurrent signal about birth and death, though again, I think this is a policy question and I don't have views on policy. Turning to the private sector, the key challenge is that a survey or even a private payroll database of businesses simply cannot reliably capture business, birth, and death, because you can't be sure when businesses pop in and out of the sample that that's actual entry and exit. This is a very challenging problem for all of our business surveys. So instead of tracking businesses, we may need to track customers or vendors. And there is some research on this, including work I did with Leland Crane and others, work by Andre Kerman and others. For example, if credit card transaction data have merchant identifiers, we might use those. We might use cell phone tracking data to track store traffic. There are online business registers that are organically updated by consumers. You might think delivery data from e-commerce firms who ship stuff to businesses and so on. Now, this gets very difficult, particularly because what works in some industries probably won't work in other industries, but I think it may be the best path forward. I'll stop there.
Hello. Does anyone remember how you make it a sludge?
3 dots on the right, click on it, go away.
3 dots.
Or Control L full screen.
Amazing. Thank you. Thank you. Hi there, my name's Ezra. I'm at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. Like Ryan and David, I will give the standard disclaimer. The views I present today are not necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago or the Federal Reserve System. And today I'm really excited to present work joint with Scott Brave at the Chicago Fed and a whole team of people who are thinking about high frequency data and alternative indices. So the question we are really interested in is how or can we use private sector alternative data to help improve official statistics, or maybe not improve, but to help complement official statistics. And that point about complements is important. I'll show you later on to foreshadow that if we just had access to the private data, we would not do a very good job of tracking the government data that we are trying to track. But being able to use both together has significant advantages over just having access to either the government data sources or the alternative data sources. So what are the problems that we face and some of the solutions we try to come up with? Alternative data are not representative usually. We often prefer if the alternative data providers don't try to make their data representative. We want this alternative data either in microdata form, as Ryan was saying, or in aggregate form to represent what the alternative data company is tracking. And we then want to use that and manipulate it and seasonally adjust it to match the government statistics that we care about and are trying to track. But alternative data is often incredibly timely. So we often don't need to wait quarters or months for official government agencies to produce the high quality data that we rely on. Instead, the alternative data is available days or weeks after the data point is measured. And we then have all of these standard models that we use at quasi-governmental agencies, at governmental agencies, to combine this data to match a statistic that we care about, right? VARs, factor models, these are well-known processes that statisticians, government agencies are using all the time to turn a bunch of sub-indicators into a big indicator that we care about. And so two of the projects that I'm involved in at the Chicago Fed are CARTS, the Chicago Fed Advanced Retail Trade Summary, and this combines high-frequency data on consumer transactions, foot traffic. I'm seeing many of our data providers in this room, which is lovely, consumer sentiment, and it combines it with the monthly census data to produce this measure very quickly of how much spending is happening in sectors that we care about. And to be clear, we care about all sectors, but this is a sector that we often track. We also have a new product that we've been working on for, I don't know, 6 to 12 months. So this is not timed to be around when appropriations lapse. And it is the Chicago Fed Labor Market Indicators product. And this combines high frequency data on separations, layoffs, hiring, other employment measures that I also see many data providers in the room who are providing us with data. Thank you. And it combines it with monthly CPS data to provide an early measure using alternative data of what is going to happen during a reference week that the CPS is tracking. So these are screenshots of the dashboard that you can all see online right now at the Chicago Fed website. And what you can see is that we separately are producing a measure of layoffs and other separations. That's a rate measure, which we are using alternative data to match to a CPS-based measure, and also the hiring rate for unemployed workers. And we then combine this into a flow-consistent unemployment rate. There are more details online. And we then take this flow-consistent unemployment rate and we match it up with the official U3 unemployment rate that we would like an early indicator of. So what can we do? Well, we all know that over the past few months, there have been changes in the availability of typical unemployment rate data. We can use all of this higher frequency private sector data to nowcast and estimate what that unemployment rate was during the reference week for which we might not get data in the future. And what we can see, we're going to compare here August to our forecast or nowcast of the October data, is we can separate out a change in the unemployment rate into a proportion due to hiring rate changing and a proportion due to the layoff and other separation rate changing. And why is this important? Because the headline number is very useful, but knowing what mechanisms are driving that headline number can be very practically useful when you're thinking about where the economy is headed or what is going on with employment data, payroll data, the unemployment rate more generally. We can also produce, based on our historical errors, confidence intervals and uncertainty surrounding that point estimate. And I was talking to some people at the earlier break, right? A point estimate is great. There's also just measurement error noise from the fact that CPS is, relying on a survey to produce these unemployment rate estimates. And there's noise from all of this private sector data and from the algorithms we fit to that private sector data and benchmark against the public data to produce this. And so what you can see is we've turned those confidence intervals into estimates of what journalists and people in the private and public sector are tracking, the chances of a change in the unemployment rate of different magnitudes that would lead us to think different things about the economy. So you can see that for October, our estimate here is in this middle range, but there's also significant uncertainty that we can track and measure. And we can say this is where we think the estimate likely was, even if this unemployment rate measure isn't produced. And we find that really valuable. This is also available online. We produce it roughly twice a month. And so you can see this going forward. We also, as I'll mention, re-benchmark it against the official rate, right? So this is a complement to the official rate. Without the official rate, we wouldn't know what we were tracking. And I think that's really important. So how do we do? I want to caveat this figure in many ways. So first, I'll just show you, we do very well. We're accurate, right? There are people here from Bloomberg. The Bloomberg data is incredible. A very important caveat to this figure is that we include the Bloomberg consensus in our model, right? And the Bloomberg consensus now might rely on our model, and that the people who are entering the Bloomberg consensus might be looking at our indicator. So when you think about measurement error here and how accurate we're being, I don't want to claim that we're incredibly accurate. What I want to say is, based on the past 7 years of private data matched to the public data, including the Bloomberg consensus in our estimate, we are doing better than the Bloomberg consensus, right? And we're certainly doing better than a random walk. As these data sets continue to rely on each other, that's going to change and be harder to disentangle. And we don't yet have our working paper online. We thought it was important to get the dashboard up, but you will be able to see how removing some of these data sets from our measures affect accuracy. And I think that's pretty important. So this is our calibration. We're pretty well calibrated, right? I think that's helpful to note, not just in terms of mean absolute error, median absolute error, but also in terms of accuracy. And one thing that I'm not going to have a figure here to talk about, but is online in a blog post, Chicago Fed Insights, Chicago Fed letter about this product, is one of the places where I think this type of model was most helpful was during the COVID-19 pandemic. Official sources were changing, private sector sources were becoming available or becoming unavailable at different rates. And if you look at where a lot of our improvements in accuracy come from, they come from that time period. They say, if we had had access to this private sector data, and if we had been running this model, then we would have had a very accurate measure of what the unemployment rate was at a time when there was a lot of uncertainty. And so one of the reasons we're excited to keep producing this indicator going forward is that in case of additional changes in the economy, we will be able to track that, I think, in pretty high frequency and relatively accurately. But going back to my prior caveat, we only know that we were accurate because we've spent the past few years calibrating these models and collecting this data. And it's possible that there are biases in what indicators we're trying to include in this model, right? We endogenously are selecting the indicators that we think are most helpful to estimating the unemployment rate. And so we don't know if going forward, we're going to be able to estimate the model as accurately as we are now. So this is a counterfactual that I think is especially relevant right now. What we've done in this chart is we've looked at a few scenarios. We've looked, as we go several months into a hypothetical loss of appropriations or shutdown, into how our accuracy is changing. And this is where I want to come back to the point about complementarity. We are producing a very accurate forecast if we have many years of up-to-date unemployment rate information. As we go several months into the future and we don't have access to that unemployment rate information, our models, they're still useful, they're still accurate, but they become less and less accurate. And you'll see in the black line, if we just lose the CPS benchmarking data, that is incredibly costly when it comes to predictive accuracy. In the second scenario, the blue line, you'll see if we also lose all the other federal government data that we rely on in our estimate, it becomes a little bit less accurate as well. So I think this is important. If you look at the magnitudes, you'll see that we become about half as accurate in terms of this measure of error when we don't have access to that data over 6 months, right? But if there's a short lapse, if we only lose access to data for a month or two, this can be a really useful plug or stopgap measure for estimating what the unemployment rate was during the time periods which we're trying to measure. So what are the appropriate use cases of alternative data? Alternative data tends to be convenient samples generated from private sources. It's not often these stratified random samples of public surveys that underlie official statistics, or if we don't have surveys, as Ryan was talking about, if we have actual ground truth data, which gets rid of a bunch more of the measurement error, it's not that either. And it can be really difficult to align the methodologies that these private alternative data sets are being used to how they're being produced with the methodologies that the statistical agencies are using. So constructing these consistent methodologies that combine all of this data, mixed frequency models, factor models, that ends up being really hard. And that's why we spent years going through and trying to use this. Also, as several panelists have mentioned, both on this panel and before, what private customers want from alternative data can be very different from what the statistical agencies need from the alternative data. And I think one point that I want to make for the economists and customers in this room is I think economists can often be very bad customers. We can often ask too many questions and really take up a lot of time from the alternative data providers. During COVID, I had these great conversations with alternative data providers, and they would come to me with a proposal, and I would say, well, what if we agree just not to bug you for a year? Can we get a slightly better contract? Can we reduce the cost to you so that we can access this data that's very easy for you to produce as long as we're not sending you emails? And that was usually pretty acceptable to these companies. The reason I think that alternative data companies are often hesitant to work with quasi-governmental agencies and governmental agencies is because we have a lot of questions. We have methodological questions. We want to take up a lot of time of the alternative data providers. And what we've found is that if we can access the raw microdata and really work with it and try to apply our own methodologies to that raw microdata, we often can avoid having some of these conversations that are very costly for the alternative data providers. On the other hand, and I'll end with this, I want to talk about a few of the challenges and maybe give some recommendations to this group and also for the alternative data companies. The first one is a very specific one that I've been spending a lot of time on over the past few weeks. Contracts often have these provisions that say you must delete the data after the contract expires. And for groups, researchers, quasi-governmental agencies, governmental agencies that are trying to make sure that our work is replicable and we can reproduce what we're trying to do, that is actually very hard for us to agree to, right? We want to be able to show people what we did, and we want to be able to provide the code and data from derived data to aggregate and produce these government statistics. And so one thing that would have saved me a lot of time that I want to recommend to this group is if there was model contract language or other information out there that would allow us to say, like, we love the idea of working with your data, this alternative data. Instead of this clause, can we include this model language from NABE or the NBER that would allow us to keep the derived data or to keep the data going forward for use only in academic publications and research? I think that would save us a lot of time, and it would also make it easier for the alternative data companies to understand why we keep redlining their contracts over and over again. The second thing I want to mention is these two data products are built alongside a graveyard of alternative data indicators that were briefly produced, for example, during the COVID-19 pandemic. As I think maybe it was David who mentioned, whenever there's significant attention being paid to a lack of data, companies spring in and provide very interesting data that is not benchmarked to government statistics. And journalists and others then latch onto this alternative data and analyze it and try to understand it and provide context to it. The most useful thing I think that alternative data companies can do is to produce their data when nothing interesting is happening, especially before something interesting happens, because we can then use that information to benchmark what they're producing against the government statistics that we're trying to track. So one anecdote that I'll end with is Carts, the first product that I talked about that tracks consumer spending in a very specific sector that we track. That has been produced several times. We first produced it internally. We used 5 to 10 alternative data providers who we worked with really well during COVID. And then a few months into us producing it, it being put onto Fred, it being part of our regular releases, one or two of the data providers just changed their mission and stopped producing the input data. And that leaves us with a few options. We can either try to string together a replacement, we can completely reproduce the index, but because of all the backtesting and careful checks we try to do, that ends up being really costly when we're producing this data. So Carts, if you look online, there's a big gap. I forget if it was 1 or 2 years between the initial release during COVID and then the version that we're producing now, which relies on new and other alternative data sets. And so one maybe recommendation both for alternative data companies and also for coordinating groups is agree to or pre-commit to producing your data for a certain number of years in a way that you can easily stick to. Maybe there's a query you're running in AWS on an S3 bucket that is not that costly for you to do. If you can just commit to putting that online or to providing it to quasi-governmental or governmental agencies on a regular basis, that would be incredibly helpful. Maybe a space for NABE or NBER. NBER already hosts a lot of data. It hosts the vital statistics data that I use as a graduate student. It hosts all of this data that is, in one place and you can always trust it will be there. It would be lovely if there was a centralized place for this data to be hosted. A lot of the warehouses that were produced during COVID to host this alternative data, then the warehouses went away after COVID because there wasn't philanthropic support or interest by other people in continuing these warehouses. And so having a consistent place that's been around for a long time that's storing those data, even if it's just the aggregate data, would allow for additional checks, replication, and improvements in methodology as we try to understand statistics. So I'll end there, but I really appreciate it. Thank you. Did you save it to the desktop or?
I was told it was still to saved here.
That was mine.
There we go. All right. I'm going to rearrange myself for a second. Can I do this? Oh no, this is fine. Okay, so good morning and thank you very much. I'm Karen Kimbrough. I'm at LinkedIn. I have the pleasure of looking at LinkedIn's economic graph. So I spend a lot of my time thinking about how do we take that data and make something interesting of it? This graph is just to kind of give you a sense of the scope of the data that I'm going to speak about today. I want to be very narrow in my focus, which is just to say, here are some of the indicators that we are committing to publish. Oh, I'm not on full screen. Apologies. All right. Yeah. Thank you for the right there. There we go. Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay. So I'm going to just spend my time here talking a little bit about some of the measures that we do consistently seek to showcase, even in boring times. Although in my 6 years at LinkedIn, it hasn't been boring looking at the labor market. I started like a month before the pandemic, and it's been fun all the way. So we have 1.2 billion members worldwide. There are about 5 million updates to the platform at LinkedIn where people are telling us if they got a new job, if they added skills, or whatever it might be. So 5 million updates per minute. Something around, I think now 69, 70 million companies will post information about what they're doing. They'll post jobs. There, any given moment, 14 million jobs will tell us what skills, what roles are happening. So there's lots and lots of fun things to look at. We're not going to look at all that today in the next 10 minutes. Let me give you like a bird's eye view of the kind of data we have. So we have profile data. That's what members share with us. It can be what jobs they're working in, what their title is. We can see their experience, skills. Some of this is inferred. Each one of these rows could be a whole hour-long conversation, but I'll go quickly through it. We also see recruiting activity. So what jobs are being posted by employers, including what roles, what levels, what skills. Are they backfills or not? There's so many interesting ways to think about this data that don't speak 100% to things like non-farm payrolls, which again is the North Star, but there's lots of other elements of the labor market that we see in our data. And I think I'm going to be pushing on that thread a little bit today. We see job seeking activity. So the extent to which job seekers are viewing applications, they are applying. Are they applying more than they were before? Yes. And then we also see sentiment data. So we survey members and get a sense of how they're feeling about the labor market. And then finally, there's the feed. That's just the conversations that people have. Are they talking about layoffs and mentioning them, or are they not? Are they talking about recession or not? And so those are things that we also look at, and this gives us a sense of maybe the vibe of the labor market, if you will, if not the data. Metrics that we actually do spend our time at our research institute looking at include job postings, again, which can be a sense of, if you think about demand for labor, this is probably a very good indication. We see hiring data, quits data, which we call the LinkedIn separation rate. We have our own measure of Slack that I want to talk about. And we also see a lot of job seeking activities I mentioned before. So people are, how are they applying? How much are they applying? Are they telling us they're open to work, even if they are working? And so all of this allows us to assess the state of the labor market, I think, writ large. Okay, so moving through it. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. I just wanted to basically give you a sense that we have this hiring rate. It looks at the pace at which members on the platform in any area, so I'll think about the US in this case, are telling us, hey, I just got hired for a new role. I'm at a new company. We do adjust for platform effects in terms of membership growth. We also seasonally adjust. Most of the data starts in 2016 for reasons just because that's when we feel like we have a really good sample to start from. So our data moves that way. It can be daily, but I do think monthly is the best metric for us. So here I just want to show you a chart of LinkedIn's hiring rate, which is the black line, against the JOLTS hiring rate. And you will see it tracks pretty well. There is co-integration there. What you will also notice, because it is like catnip to anybody looking at this chart, is there's a big deviation at the time of the pandemic. Okay, so what is that? Well, really the way to think about this is when people are, people obviously on the black line, that big drop means nobody was telling us they were getting hired because they weren't getting hired, right? And so we don't necessarily capture some of the turning points that happen when people change their profile. What it does suggest, and this is work that was done with my colleague Corey Kantanga, which I neglected to mention at the beginning, and he pointed this out, is what it does suggest is that perhaps we are able to see in our profile data whether or not people think that their hiring or their employment lapse is permanent or maybe just temporary. And so the extent to which people are updating their hiring data may tell us whether or not they actually expect this to last a long time or not. In this case, I think people weren't entirely sure, but we definitely saw a big gap there. So we don't see always all the turning points, but we do actually capture quite well the general trend. I'm going to skip through. This is just us plotting these, and you'll see that the red dots that are not on the line are from the pandemic. Big surprise, those are outliers. We also can look at something we call the LinkedIn separation rate. This is really our measure of quits. And this is the idea that people tell us that they are departing a position. They again are updating their profile. I think what I would highlight here is that when people are updating their profile, they are more likely to update it when they are voluntarily separating than involuntary separation. This series tracks pretty closely. There isn't a co-integration here exactly, but the black line that's solid is the smoothed LinkedIn separation rate. The green line is the JOLTS quit rate, and they track each other pretty closely. So again, this is one where we think we have something of a read based on our sample that tells us a little bit about what's happening with at least more voluntary separations. You can imagine all the reasons why there might be less likelihood for people to want to show us that they had an involuntary separation. There's also lags that we do take into account when you think about the fact that some people have exits that are more extended or they have severance, and so they're just not quite really leaving the company right away. Again, you'll see there's a little bit less of an adherence to a line here. But we do use the separation rate to predict the quit rate. And by the way, just a little spoiler, when we get to the end, I'll show you what some of these measures are saying for right now. So there is like a little surprise at the end, a little gift to you, even though the government's reopened, which is wonderful. So we also look at labor market tightness, and there are lots of different ways to think about it. We think about the number of job openings on our platform divided by the number of unique applicants, because you can have people applying for multiple jobs. And we do impose some constraints, and we can relax them or not, but are you in the same country, so I don't have people in one country applying to jobs somewhere else. I could even impose that you're in the same industry if I wanted to kind of say how tight or slack is a particular industry. Something I didn't mention at the beginning, because I wanted to be pretty quick in my remarks, was that obviously our data lets us look by geography. So we can look by country, by major metro area. We can, to some degree, understand dynamics based on whether it is a male or a female member. We can understand dynamics, of course, by occupation as well in some cases. So it allows for a certain level of granularity that's kind of fun to like wheel yourself around in. And then at some point you have to bring yourself back up and say, okay, but what's the big picture? So let me just cut to the chase. So LinkedIn's measure of slack is in the black line. This is a job openings per unemployed measure. And there are differences. There are pretty significant differences. I think if I were very quickly summarizing this, I would say one of the things to call out is that we don't just consider unemployed people, but also people who are perhaps employed but looking, which is something we can, of course, capture. Other measures can too, but that's something we include. And we also probably have a sampling skew to some degree. So we are capturing certain aspects of the labor market very, very, very well. And if you want to talk about tech company, I think we've got, everybody on there is on here. So we'll have a good read. But if you want to talk about other occupations, other industries, we may have a slightly more arm's length perspective. But I will say 1 in 5 jobs now don't require a college degree on our platform. And so we are kind of capturing some of that, but just not all of it to the same degree, I think, as what you might call a classic white collar role. But what you'll see here is, of course, that Slack, has well, we'll say the tightness has increased and then it decreased. And what really my takeaway is that things haven't appreciably changed in the last few months. It's been fairly steady. Okay, so I'm going to move quickly through some of my charts. The last point I wanted to say, and full disclosure, this isn't something we actually publish as a metric, but I just wanted to show it, is we've also looked at churn, just because I think it's been so important. I feel like I've been a broken record for a few years, saying, gosh, the labor market's very sluggish, hiring is very slow. And a lot of that has to do with people not particularly moving jobs. They moved a bunch of jobs in 21 and 22, and then they kind of stayed put, and employers were busy digesting all that headcount and got whiplashed by this call for efficiency, and I think they suddenly weren't feeling very efficient. So we saw a kind of, I would say, diminished amount of churn or turnover in the labor market, and that's something we kind of think of as just a background evidence of like momentum and opportunity. Okay, so let me move a little forward here. So some of the metrics that I just talked about are ones where if we think we have some co-integration and we look at Granger causal connections, they can allow us to predict what we think the data might be. And I'm really cautious in this. You will see that we aren't putting out regular reports of our data, but I'll just say, hey, this is what it looks like to us. And you guys can discount or include it as you like. And so what we're seeing is evidence that things are kind of, I would say, soft, but softening more slowly now than they were in the past, but still relatively soft. So the hiring rate is still slumped, slow. The quits rate hasn't really moved by our measures. You'll see that our measures of non-farm payrolls are, I'll just call it subdued, extremely subdued. And there's a few asterisks there for some notes. And we don't see a huge move in the unemployment rate. So we haven't seen, by our data, we're not seeing that something radically changed between, let's say, August and now, but we see softness. Maybe, and this is my last slide. So if you were to ask me, well, what from our data do we perceive as the state of the labor market today? It would be a mild deceleration, maybe from September to October. If you look in that first column that says last month, you'll see there aren't terribly big changes over the month in the hiring rate, what we call the separation rate, the quits rate, or even in tightness, like the number of jobs per applicant. So not like a huge deterioration. The bigger story is in the final right-hand column, where you see since what I call the pre-COVID, like heyday of 2019, when things felt pretty darn good, there's been a lot of weakening in the labor market. No surprise, but we definitely see it in our data. Okay. I think with that, I'm just going to close here and say thanks. And it's been a real pleasure to be able to speak to you today. And I want to thank again, Katharine and Jim and Karen for having me here. So thank you very much.
Why don't we go ahead and see if there are any questions for the panelists who have spoken so far while we're working out the technical difficulties. And Bill.
I just wanted to make an observation about QCEW. So everyone is confident that if we went to a quarterly basis on QCEW, we would be better off. And I think that's probably right. But it may be not understood that the Bureau makes a significant investment just to get the March numbers right. The other quarters are maybe not as good. And so if you're using the birth death model on the other quarters, some of the error may be source data error. And if we invested more in getting the states to really do a good job in supplying the data for the second, third, and fourth quarter QCEW publications, we could then say, well, quarterly benchmarking is okay. The only quarter that I would trust, honestly, is the first quarter. So.
Sounds like a topic that needs further conversation. I had a question for you, Karen, if I could. Your very interesting comments focused mainly on things that LinkedIn is producing that more or less parallel what's coming out of the official statistics. And I wonder if you could say just a few words about things that we can learn from the LinkedIn data that we just can't learn with the current set of official statistics.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. And if you'd given me a full hour, I would have waxed lyrical about the things that we can't do. So but your question is really about the things that maybe we do that other people don't see. And I feel like when I arrived at LinkedIn, some of the things I discovered was just the job seeking behavior, which is sort of an early indicator of where things are going, almost a precursor. So the idea, do I start to see people viewing applications more? Are they applying to more applications when they come online? Are they more urgent by necessity job seeking, or just because the labor market feels like it's fun and they want to explore for a higher wage? So that's one area where I think we have a lot to show. We also, and I didn't get into this at all, but you can imagine we have an extensive amount of data on firms, from size, from location, from headcount. I would venture to say that the work we're looking at on just AI startups, because that's an area that we can capture, is fascinating and probably pretty comprehensive. So we can see certain types of small firm behavior and large firm behavior and how they interact. We see when people are, let's say, open for work, or they are changing work or laid off, where they go. If you recall, there was a moment when there was a lot of talk about tech worker layoffs, and just really briefly, we were able to see that actually, in fact, they were getting hired. They were just getting hired outside of tech. So anyway, I think there's a lot of space there for us to add maybe the meta, understanding of the labor market.
I'm hoping somebody will give me the high sign when we've got the technical issues worked out, but we'll start here. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself when you. Okay. Okay. If you wouldn't mind identifying yourself before you ask your question, we'll start over here. Jed, with you.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jed Kolko. I'm actually on the next panel, so more shortly. A question though about labor market data, and particularly during the shutdown. How worried should we be about, I guess I'd call it like availability bias? The fact that the private sector there are more options, private sector options for measuring non-farm payrolls, which is a much weaker measure right now of the labor market than of household survey measures, which are still relatively strong by historical standards. How much should we worry that the types of indicators that are easier for the private sector to produce might end up carrying more weight in looking at broad questions like the labor market or the overall economy for the purposes of policymaking?
I think that there's others on the panel that can answer, but can I just say one thing? I would say, from a LinkedIn perspective, our goal is not to replace any government sector data. We're completely supportive of the idea that that's the gold standard. But the idea is, can we add sort of, I don't know, a little more extra insight into either motivations or turning points for certain data? So for us, I don't think we seek to replicate it. I did show that we could, but I think we want to just be additive and complementary.
Is it on or yes? Okay. So we are trying to match the household survey, and I think one of the reasons is because it's really important to track not only the measures that the alternative data companies can really closely match, but also how those measures relate to the household survey data that we're also relying on. And so and I completely agree, we're not trying to use the alternative data to replace the government data, and I showed that we need the government data in order to benchmark the private sector data. But also, even if an alternative data company is producing something like Google searches for unemployment, or LinkedIn data on job searches, or data from Indeed, or ADP, that data can still be very useful when benchmarked correctly and adjusted correctly for tracking what is going on in the labor market according to the household surveys, and that's what we're trying to do.
Andrew Reamer, George Washington University. The BLS system for collecting labor statistics is largely a cooperative statistical system between the federal government and the state government. And to facilitate that, the federal government, BLS, gives grants to states. It's about $70 million a year, and ETA adds in another $35 million. An issue is that the that number has not changed for 25 years. So the number I just cited were the appropriations in 2002, and Congress has not changed that. So, Katharine, this is really a question for you as former BLS commissioner. Just tell people a bit about the role of the cooperative system in this, the role of the states in this, in producing the data, and the implications of Congress not changing the budget number for 2 decades.
Well, you've laid out how this works. A lot of the work on producing the statistics goes on in the states, though less so than used to be the case. The BLS has brought more of that into the national office. You know, the BLS is hurting, the states are hurting. I don't know, I don't know what I can add to that, but you're right to point that out as an issue. If the states are not adequately funded, that has adverse effects on the quality of the whole infrastructure. So.
Hi, Tarek Hassan from Boston University. I just wanted to give a plug for essentially a little bit of investment into public goods of making the private sector data interface with other data sources that we're already using. So there's a brilliant paper by Brian Siegmiller and co-authors on LinkedIn data that looks at essentially the use of AI at the firm level and basically takes like the CVs from, I don't know whether they talk to you or not, but like, if not, then forget about it. But so essentially taking the CVs from LinkedIn and collapsing them at the firm level, and basically looking at a time series of AI adoption at the firm levels. A really nice paper. It's an absolute nightmare for them to figure out which firm is which. And I feel like if that work was done once, and it was integrated with the LinkedIn data, it would really make everyone's life much easier. We have similar issues with earnings calls and figuring out which CompuStat firm is which earnings call, which job posting belongs to which firm, and so forth. And we're all doing this like with 2 RAs and no funding at BU. I feel like, there's really returns to scale to this kind of effort. That wasn't a question, I guess.
But we heard you. Yeah.
And I'll just say we love getting our data through Haver or other aggregators, Fred, that make it much easier for us to incorporate it via API calls and other systems directly into what we're doing. And that makes it easier when they're added or changed or looking at vintages. So I agree with that.
Just to pick up on that comment, there's sort of a theme that's emerging, which is the statistical agencies are the only entity that have as their mission producing statistics that are going to be produced on a regular schedule and that are going to be reproducible. And that's an issue with using some of the private sources of data. I suggest we take one last question and then take a short break and give the tech folks time to figure out the issue we're having with getting Nela on, and then have her right after the break. So John?
Hi, John Sablehouse, Brookings Institution. My question really relates back to my time with David Wilcox at the Federal Reserve in the post-Great Recession period, when thinking about counts of jobs and the unemployment rate was part of the job, but it was there was a lot more uncertainty about what's happening with labor force participation rates. And what I'm wondering is there anything in the offing in terms of what Indeed might be doing, other social media, if we worry about declining response rates, with the CPS, and that's our only indication of people's aspirations in terms of labor market activity, is there any way with these new data or approaches that we might be able to get at what's happening with labor market participation?
Sure, I'll say one thing on that, which is one of the values of having all of these parameters that we're estimating that relate the alternative data to the official data is if the relationship changes, we can dig in and try to figure out why. So if we see that like some of the degradation of response rates and other things that you mentioned and others have mentioned is coinciding with a change in those parameters, that tells us something really interesting about whether the relationship between the private and the public sector data is changing, and also whether we should change how much we're trusting various versions of the data that are being produced. On the other hand, I don't think we've seen that yet. So I think there are many statisticians and economists working to make sure that those attrition rates are dealt with in the reweighting processes and the adjustment processes. But I think that is a value in having a bunch of other people who are working with other data sets and trying to compare them.
We're going to stop here a little early and take.
Nela has a 10:45 other commitment, so we should continue for a second,
Ah.
see if we can find this, and maybe just have her call in and put a phone next to the microphone.
Now. Yeah. Okay. I'm not sure what we're doing.
Need another quick question?
Yes.
As I've already revealed, I'm obsessed by the collapse in the initiation rate. And this is, I feel there's a TV series that features leaving one cabinet member behind. So I'm a little nervous to be in the same room with two former commissioners of BLS. Would it be possible to, it's particularly concerning to see that drop in the initiation rate if the firms that agree are somehow different from firms that don't agree. Would it be possible for BLS inside the firewall to track the CES employment trends of firms that don't agree to participate in the CES because you observe, sorry, the QCEW, excuse me, employment trends, because BLS employees will be able to see both. And if the answer was, they both moved together, then I'll take my apprehension level down.
I think Ryan has a.
I don't know the answer to what BLS can do, but there's a 2010 paper by Steve Davis and several co-authors that I put on my slides, in which they kind of did this for JOLTS using BED microdata. And that is they tried to, there's Steve. They tried to systematically figure out, they were able to directly compare non-responders to responders, right? And figure out their properties using the administrative microdata. So this seems like the type of thing that maybe could be done subject to these QCW quality concerns that Bill mentioned.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
briefly, that's exactly what we did, very much in the spirit of what you described. There were quite strong systematic differences. You could model them and adjust for them. And more interesting in the JOLTS case is they were also very cyclically sensitive. So you tended to do especially poorly around cyclical turning points.
I suspect BLS is going to have something, some stuff to do when they get back in. But I put that on the agenda.
I can also fill in opposite side, local labor market data. How far have y'all gotten in extending national views to local data?
And repeat the question, probably people online didn't hear it.
Local data, and how far can you use what we're doing now to extend it to the local areas?
I can start. So we actually, I mentioned earlier, are able to look at data by state, by, I'll call it large metro area. And we do seek to share that data, obviously in an anonymized, aggregated way with local policy leaders, whether it's at the governor level or the mayoral level, to help them understand who's hiring in their area, what are the skills gaps that are evident, and also if we see people moving, because I didn't get into that, but we also see the migration data of talent and where it's clustered. So that's also been fascinating, frankly, to see people moving around the country in the last 5 years. I don't know if I answered your question, but that's kind of what we say. Thank you.
Okay, so Nela, we're going to try, if you turn off the sound that you're hearing, then we think we should be able to just listen to you.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm retitling this. I hear an echo. You guys hear the echo or no?
She should be able to use her microphone. Like, I think this is all set up. She should be.
I'll try to ignore the echo.
Okay, all right. Nela, try unmuting yourself, and we're going to see if that works. We think you may be able to come through the Zoom.
Yeah. So.
How is that? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.
All right. This is a perfect example of data on the fly. It's innovation in the moment, and it's meeting the moment. So that's exactly the title. Thanks, Jim, for getting us to this point, and thanks for the organizers of the conference. I don't have a lot of time to share with you, but I do want to make a couple of what I think are critical points for this moment. And say a little bit about ADP and the data and where I think we fit in this discussion. I'm joining you from New York City, so I'm going to take a portfolio frame on data. I think of data as a portfolio that each has a different purpose at a different period of time. But like most investors in this city, you would never put all of your eggs in one basket. And I remember in 2020 how fascinated we were with open door, or not open door, what was that? Open table data as a measure of consumer. And now we only use it to make reservations. So every data can have a place and time. I want to share with you about ADP data, who's been putting out a public sector view or a public view of private data for the last 20 years. Not fly by night, but really has been part of the data fabric for a while. And I think we have some important and interesting things to say. So if we could advance the slide a couple of spots, I'll tell you when to stop. One more. That's our vision statement, a world that works better. I think that's a good.
I'm very sorry to say we cannot see your slides.
Okay.
So we're listening to you.
I got you. All right. So I'm going to start then with how representative ADP's data is. And I think that's an important starting point. One thing I've heard in the discussion to date is a pretty broad brush treatment of private sector data. Not all private sector data is the same, but I do think all of it is becoming of growing importance in this very complex labor market that we have. One thing that we've done recently, and that's since I've started at ADP, is that we partnered with Stanford University to retool the National Employment Report that has been in existence for about 20 years, as I mentioned, in order to provide a more granular and deeper look into the labor market from the private sector view. And I think that is an illustration of the kind of partnership that could take off in the modern era. What we do essentially is leverage the 26 million workers that ADP pays around the country. 26 million, that's about 20% of the private sector. And we use the quarterly census of employment and wages that's been discussed in this panel so far to benchmark that data. That benchmarking process is critical. You can think of both the BLS jobs estimates and the ADP estimates as really just nowcast of what we'll get from this near population universe of the QCEW 6 or 7 months in the future. And so in that benchmarking, we are able to show that ADP data is both large and representative and granular. So in my view, what you would want if you could dream up your ideal data set is the comprehensiveness that comes from the quarterly census of employment and wages and the frequency and granularity that comes from ADP data. In fact, we pay on a weekly basis. This is not a survey. It is built really on the backs of workers. Every paycheck is counted, and those paychecks are benchmarked by size, industry, and geography based on the QCEW. Now, fortunately, about a couple of weeks ago, I wrote with my co-author, Eric Brynjolfsson at the Stanford Digital Economy Lab, a white paper on the representativeness of ADP data. So since we don't have slides, I'd like to refer you to that paper on adpresearch.com, where you can get exact representation by all of these different categories between the ADP data set and the BLS data set. We tend to bend more towards manufacturing in the Northeast. The ADP data is a convenient sample. It's based on ADP clients' payrolls, but it's been shown to be quite representative by industry, firm size, and geography. I don't know if you can see my slides now. If someone can, just nod, but if not, I'll just keep going. But that paper is available on our website. So I think the first thing to note about private sector data when you look at the labor market is there an ability to benchmark it, and not just in labor market, but in inflation or any other metrics that we care about. Is there a standard set of truth, even if it's months into the future, that we can evaluate this data? We've also shown in that paper how ADP stacks up to the BLS employment numbers for the first 6 months of the year. The ADP numbers do revise, but they don't revise much. We count paychecks which have different frequencies: weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. And so many of our revisions are driven by just getting more monthly pays for the reference week. That includes the 12th. But it's important to note that we've always thought of our data as weekly. In fact, with the retooling in 2022 that we did, we based that retooling on a weekly data set. So when we relaunched the National Employment Report in August of 2022, we provided weekly data going back to 2010, both seasonally and non-seasonally adjusted for all of these three categories: industry, firm size, census division. But for the first 6 months of this year, we thought it was instructive to look at how the BLS stacks up to the ADP numbers, both the original first print numbers and the revisions. And we've found, and all of this is in the paper, that the difference after revisions are just 14,000 jobs over the first 6 months of the year. Those are the 6 months that we do have final revisions from the BLS. And so these numbers tend to move together. And while they often separate on a month-by-month look, which we do provide in the paper, the trend is similar. And I think when you're trying to read a very complex labor market, getting different perspectives that show similar trends can give confidence in decision-making, whether it's a policymaker or a business. But we didn't stop there. When we understood that this moment required a bit more granularity, we thought, what could we do in terms of our data to meet that moment? And it wasn't just the absence of official statistics over the last month and maybe the next month. It really was all these other mega trends that we are counting. We partner, as I said before, with Stanford, who's very focused on AI and the impact of AI on the workforce. We also know that the United States is an aging workplace. 10,000 people turn 65 or older every single day. And just these two mega trends alone, and there are many others, have the impact on the labor market that could be valuable to really understand and measure in real time. We've seen that our high frequency data has been really important when it comes to extreme weather events, for example, whether it's fires in LA or hurricanes along the coast. Being able to understand where paychecks are leaving and in what industries can be helpful on the ground as people try to rebuild. And so we brought all of this to fruition just 2 weeks ago when we decided to launch the NER Pulse Report, which is a weekly look at preliminary estimates, also benchmarked, also seasonally adjusted, of the labor market to capture all of these fast-moving trends. I think what I'd like to underscore at this point, since my remarks will be more conceptual, since you can't see the slides, than it is pointing out different aspects of the labor market, what I'd like to underscore is that the labor market has changed structurally. And so our measures for understanding that labor market also need to evolve. And to me, that is a more is more approach, not just employment change, but also wage changes. The Great Resignation, we saw a big jump in paychecks for people who were switching jobs. The premium between a job stayer's wage growth and a job changer's wage growth jumped to almost 9 percentage points. If you weren't leaving your job and getting more money or getting another offer to get more money at your same job, you were missing out. You were actually treading lower than inflation. And in fact, in our data, we were able to see and show that people got competing offers in order to keep up with the pace of inflation at that time. Now that wage premium has shrunk to about 2.1 percentage points, under 3 percentage points for the last 2 years, meaning that workers are staying put. There's less motivation to leave. So these lower turnover drivers are also an important component of the labor market. In my final statement, I do want to bend a little bit towards what's going on with AI, because it's already having an impact. And because of ADP's granular data, we can actually look at the demographic impact of AI exposed occupations. We can see actual occupations, not just jobs. So we know exactly where the AI exposure is being felt. And we're seeing it in an AI exposed occupations for early career. So the starting off point for many US workers is already being challenged by technological change. AI is also augmenting certain parts of the occupational spectrum. And this is, again, research that we've done with Stanford University. So I am happy to share the full slate of slides. All of our research is available at adpresearch.com. And my concluding thoughts, I really hope and support the collaborative nature of the discussion so far, understanding that government data has an important role in our understanding, and that private sector data can be a very helpful supplement, especially in times of enormous transition like the ones we are in now. Thank you, and I hope that you have a great rest of the conference.